And the beautiful thing about stories, and as you know, I'm very involved in storytelling projects with my students a lot, but every culture throughout time has had storytelling, story circles, family traditions of stories passed down to it. It's universal. So I really feel like the whole piece about enjoying stories, sharing in stories, creating stories, knowing your story, helping someone else write their story. This is a universal humanity piece. It's not just a literacy piece or an English language learner piece or something that you fill out on a Scantron piece. It's a piece of humanity. Getting to know your story, putting your story in a place where it'll be passed down to the ages, allowing your story to grow and change and evolve. But having said that, and being in this very happy place with this beautiful, beautiful work of yours, I need to switch gears for a minute here and do a little devil's advocate work and bring up the piece about assessment. When it comes to teaching in the classroom, what a lot of us face is the age-old credo of, well, if we value it, we have to assess it. How does one assess the skills and creativity and collaboration that falls under something like a story quest?
I knew you would have to bring that up. My personal experience is that the assessment happens within the story itself. Assessment happens through self-assessment as you're given feedback as you're going along, from your peers, from your teacher even. Watching your teacher learn is an important skill to master yourself. That's how you learn. We watch people learn. Assessment is part of project-based experiential learning. And you demonstrate the mastery of what you've learned by doing something, as opposed to coming back and having to take a test later. In other words, the assessment is built into the activities.
I think the key concept. I think the key that we're talking about, and I think both Jim G. and Peggy Sheehy have made this point about gaming, is that the assessment is part of the game. If you're sitting and you're playing, just your basic entertainment game, you're going to progress because you've completed a task, because you've problem solved. Ultimately, the same is going to be true on this story quest, and is going to be measured by the teacher. And in other words, has there been engagement? Has there been something produced as a result of this? Has there been attitude changes? Ultimately, what we're trying for here, and what Peggy was talking about before, is really not just somebody being able to tell their story, but also being able to hear somebody else's story and appreciate that story. Ultimately, we're moving in this direction towards globalization and diverse communities, diverse cultures, and one of the things that's going to be very important for the 21st century is building the capacity for empathy and understanding, and the ability to relate to different people. And part of that is your ability to tell your story and your ability to listen to, hear, respect, and appreciate somebody else's story. And then collectively, you've woven these narrative threads into a community that is diverse and large and hopefully someday global.
Right, and I think what I always hear Jenaia reference the point that it's not about our differences, it's about learning about our similarities, and then once we make that connection and we see the ways in which we are similar, then we can celebrate our differences. And I've heard Jenaia speak to that before. I
think that a lot of the fear gets dissolved too, don't you?
Oh yeah. Like that strange person who dresses differently than I, who may celebrate holidays differently than I. Once we have shared stories, or once we have shared someone else's story together, and we're both feeling the same questions because it's the human condition. The responses fall into the human condition, not the cultural condition or the political condition. And that's when we're truly accomplishing that piece of really celebrating the human spirit and putting aside, I mean, I know I start to embark on this and I feel like a Hallmark greeting card, but it's really very true that when we can put aside those differences and celebrate them instead of finding them something to be threatened by or feared by, I mean, that's the world we want for our children. That's the world we want, but we especially want that world for our children. And this is one beautiful tool of just finding the human condition, speaking to the human condition, and sharing the human condition.
You know, that was one of the reasons we did the Uncle D story quest about HIV/AIDS, because I work at Karuna and we find that one of our biggest problems is the stigma attached to HIV/AIDS. And so people don't want to know about it. But by taking a quest where you get to know someone and really care about him and his family and his life and even his cat, he becomes real to you. And you can't not care, and all of a sudden you realize, you know, you have something to learn from this so-called dreaded disease as well, and you learn that you can celebrate a life of someone with HIV/AIDS. The human condition,
absolutely.
As she said.
And in my own experience with Uncle D, it was we had the same book. One of the books on his coffee table is a book that I have, and I have a cat. He has a cat. He massages his cat, I massaged my cat. I mean, it was just little things like that, but more importantly, you know, his feelings and his musings in his little sketches when he starts to write and goes introspective, and, you know, that struggle that he had with, you know, allowing himself to be a writer, allowing himself to journal his final days. How many of us have all just gone through that experience of, you know, I'm not a writer, how can I sit down and write? And this experience that you have both provided in the Story Quest gives every participant permission to be a writer. And I find that in itself, if there were nothing else, and there is so much more to it, but if there were nothing else to it, that simple piece about saying you now have permission to love words, you now have permission to have feelings and to write about them and to share them. That is just so incredibly valuable. So just to wrap up the assessment piece a little bit, I guess what you're saying then is, rather than saying that assessment is a bad thing, because we all as educators have to realize that it's not going away anytime soon, I guess what we need to see is to have it be authentic assessment, built into that actual learning experience.
Oh, what's the goal?
I would agree.
What's the goal that you're trying to measure? I mean, here, you know, what we're saying out loud is that in the 21st century, we have to cultivate and develop people's emotional intelligence. That's really the key. And part of the way in which we'll judge whether we've accomplished that is going to be by seeing what they say, what they write, what they are as unique individuals, not just their ability to come through some test that is going to measure whether they are like everybody else.